This podcast is sponsored by the Music Player Network at musicplayer.com, the premier musician resource for keyboard players and beyond. Since the year 2000, the Music Player Network has been the go-to source for news and views on music technology, playing tips, and gigging help. The Keyboard Corner is one of the longest-running keyboard forums in internet history, with guitar, bass, drum, and numerous recording and music tech forums also on offer. Frequented by weekend warriors, manufacturers' representatives, and professionals alike, MPN provides an invaluable resource for any musician, and it's 100% free to sign up and use. Go to www.musicplayer.com to see for yourself.
Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. I'm your host David Holloway and it's great as always to be here with you. My valued co-host Paul Bindig can't join us tonight. For some reason he feels the need to feed himself and his family rather than join and have fun with me. So, very devastated, but I am pleased to report that one of Paul's great friends, bandmates and all-round good guy Matt Goodluck has joined me. Matt, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, David. Thank you for having me on the show.
No, my pleasure. And I haven't just invited you on because you're a great guy. I've actually invited you on for a very good reason. Well, there's two good reasons. One is that you're a devotee of a great deal of prog rock, which links to the guest we're speaking to today, which is Oliver Wakeman. And the second point is that you've actually met and known and spent some time with Oliver Wakeman. So tell us a bit about that.
That's right. Back in my youth, I travelled to the UK, and to cut a long story short, I kind of wound up on Clive Nolan's doorstep. Clive was very good at taking me in and looking after me, and we got along famously, obviously, because I had a huge interest in the prog scene, and he was working quite a lot in that scene. And that's how I got to meet Oliver. As you'll hear in the interview, Oliver did a few albums with Clive back in the mid-90s, and the studio where they recorded was actually where I used to live. So I was very fortunate to be around during those days and getting to meet lots of really interesting musicians that passed through the studio there. And Oliver really was a great guy. We got along very well, and we were a lot closer in age than Clive and myself were, and so we just kind of really hit it off, and we shared a lot of the same favourite albums and things like that. So it was really nice to get to meet Oliver. So it was fantastic to get to interview him.
Yeah, so as you'll hear, it's a bit of a reunion. Is it fair to say, Matt, you won't have spoken to Oliver since you left the UK? So it'd be, 20 years?
Yeah, it's been quite some time. Yeah. So, yeah.
No, so it's a great interview. And as Matt mentioned, Oliver's a great guy as well. So I think you'll enjoy this interview a lot. Enjoy. Oliver, thank you so much for joining. Really thrilled to have you here.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
So a regular question over the past year in COVID-19 times, and the UK certainly hasn't been immune from that, is about how have you been keeping busy, and particularly in your case, how have you been keeping busy post-Freedom Day?
Freedom Day, I'm not really sure what's changed here. It's a bit chaotic, isn't it, really? Nobody really knows. It's just basically people saying, now take charge of yourselves. And that seems slightly shaky at the best of times. But we seem to be doing okay. It's nice to be able to go for a walk and go in places. But the lockdown itself was I'm just busy. I never stop anyway. So just lockdown just was more time to be busy and do more busy things. And it was quite nice. Did a couple of projects, lots of sessions, and just kept myself massively busy writing and recording. Yeah, I think the main thing was probably not playing live. It was the first year last year that I never played live, and I think I've been playing at least a gig or two every year, probably since. Just trying to think how far back that is. Probably since about when I did my first gig, which was back in 88, something like 89.
Yeah,
I probably played every year since then. My very first gig, I remember my very first gig. It was in a pub, and with the band playing original material, and I couldn't afford keyboards, so I borrowed a couple of keyboards from a friend. And I couldn't afford a keyboard stand, so I nicked my mum's ironing board.
Oh,
and
nice.
I remember somebody I did the show. Somebody came up to me, put 20 quid in my hand, and said, "There's a pint behind the bar for you." And I was just thought, this is it. This is what I want to do.
Oh.
So every year since then I've played, except for last year, no gig. I mean, I did some virtual concerts, which sort of counting, but it's not quite the same as actually, standing in front of an audience and interacting.
And I think it's fair to say then you have missed the live work. Looking forward to getting back to it.
I have. I mean, obviously I've done loads of band works, trios, duos, all sorts of manner of stuff. But the thing I've been doing up until lockdown, which was, I've been working a lot with an artist called Rodney Matthews, who's a phenomenal artist. And he did an album a couple of years ago, which I was heavily involved in. And we started to do these art and music shows, which were gallery showings. And I would sit and play a grand piano for a concert to people, which was really nice because it was completely different to big rock shows and all the extravagant stuffs. But to just sit there with a grand piano, an audience of people that want to listen to you, and you're surrounded by wonderful artwork, they were really enjoyable. And we did a few of those and planning to do more. But then, obviously the pandemic hit and suddenly everybody stopped. And but that was quite good fun because it puts you on the spot. Have I got enough? Not music. I've got plenty of music to do, but have you got enough information there to do a live piano show?
Yeah. And Matt, it feels like Oliver's read our running sheet because we are going to ask you about Rodney later, so we'll definitely be coming back to that. So that's good.
Marvelous. I won't talk too much about it.
No,
I generally do this interview. I'll answer about 30 questions in the first one, and then everyone goes, "Oh, that was great. Thanks very much."
That's funny. Well, what we usually do, Oliver, is start off with a bit of a potted history of yourself. So obviously, you grew up in a musical family, but just a bit of a potted history of your what got you into music and those early years, which you've sort of just alluded to with the ironing board. And I just love the fact that, like a lot of us, you started off with an ironing board stand.
Yeah, I mean, my very first inkling of wanting to do music was I was about 4. I think I was 4, and I distinctly remember walking into the we had a big grand piano in our lounge when my mum and dad were still together, and I walked into and I picked up the lid of the piano and put my hands on it, and I hit a perfect chord and it sounded amazing, and I went, wow, and that was it. And I thought, brilliant, I like this. And then of course tried to do it again, and then it just sounded horrible. So I realized that I was going to have to sort of learn properly. So I sort of said to my mum, I'd like to do piano. And I distinctly remember having to sit in the piano room when I was 5 in primary school, when they put the stars and things on your fingers to tell you what notes to hit. And looking out the window, seeing all my friends playing and thinking, okay, so I've got to put the work in here. And that was it. And I did all the usual sort of stuff that teenagers do, picked up guitars, played football, chase girls, all the usual sort of stuff that everybody does in between trying to learn how to do music stuff. And just sort of, I ended up moving down to Devon, which in England is sort of a West Country down near the coast. Because I used to live up in more in the central part of England, and I found that in North Devon there was a thriving pub scene of live music, because obviously there were lots of tourists that came down. There was lots of places to play, and I just ended up joining and playing anywhere and with anybody. I joined house bands. I joined jam nights, do duo gigs, and anywhere. Joined function bands, playing all sorts of music that I didn't particularly enjoy, but it was sort of part of my road to learning how to do it and learning how to be in front of people, and playing with sort of in jam bands was massively helpful, because that really teaches you how to interact with other musicians and the cues to look for. And you're up there and somebody says, okay, we're doing this, it's an A, off we go, and you're sort of sitting there thinking, don't recognize that change, and you suddenly have to learn how to watch a guitarist's fingers and understand where they are on the fretboard. Oh, okay, it's F sharp there. Oh, okay, up to D. Right, I've got it. And then you learn all these bits and pieces, and that was. I mean, I did classical training, but I always maintained that the training I got from playing in those bands was just as important as the technique and the formative training, because it just allowed you to work with other musicians. And ultimately, as musicians, that's what we all like doing, is playing with other people. We get a kick out of, any number of people coming together and making a sound that doesn't sound too horrible.
So what sort of extent did those influences play a part in you forming your own identity as a musician?
Let me think.
So when you were talking about first playing the piano at a young age, was it just something towards, or was it because Dad was, around the house and playing as well?
I think what everybody wants to say is that, I watched Dad play all the time and it was phenomenal, and that's why I wanted to be a piano player. But it kind of wasn't really that, because my mum and Dad divorced when I was 5. Yeah. And I didn't see my dad from being up until the age of 5. I don't really remember much for the first 2 or 3 years, but then he was away. Then he was away for most of the time. He was away on tour, and ended up. So I only really saw him every now and then. So I didn't really sort of clock that much with him. We just lived in an unusual. I lived in an unusual house, I suppose. That is when I was growing up. I knew it was slightly different because, it was quite a big house, and we had stuff that sort of other people maybe didn't have. That wasn't even just somebody with some money. It was sort of an unusual sort of lifestyle. We had my dad collected cars, and we had Clark Gable's Cadillac in the back garden, and we had the Yes Tales from Topographic Oceans stage set in the back garden, and weird things like that just became pretty standard because it's the only childhood you know. So that bit I knew was sort of slightly different. But when it came to music influences, I think I just sort of liked the piano. I felt I had a natural aptitude for it. My body seemed to make sense to my brain, and things seemed to come easier than really other instruments that I play. But when it came to sort of being influenced by his music, I remember when he moved back to the UK, when I was about 12, I think, when he married his third wife. I remember sort of talking to my stepmom, and she was talking about a concert he was doing, and she was talking about Journey to the Centre of the Earth, and I said, I've never heard it. And she went, What do you mean you've never heard it? And I said, I haven't heard it. And she looked at Dad and said, Rick, this is ridiculous. How come your son hasn't really heard what you do? And I'd heard bits because my mum, when I was in my early teens, my mum went into the loft and dragged down a load of records that he'd left behind when he'd gone. And, that was, that story has just made me remind me of a record I need to put onto my list. She brought these records down, and one of them was Tales from Topographic Oceans, and there was a few others there. And I suddenly started listening to this stuff. And then when I went to Dad's house, and he got out a few records for me. Tomato was one of them, and what was the other one he got me out? Was Tomato, and he did get me King Arthur and Journey, and I sort of still remember those albums. And that was when I sort of went, oh, okay. And then I just sort of didn't just do what probably most people think I've done because of the work I've done later in my years. I didn't just sit there and do nothing but work out Dad's piano parts. I never, ever did. Just sort of went, this is great. What else is there? And then I did what most people do in their teens, which is that they suddenly realize that everything in the charts is pretty dreadful. And they suddenly try to discover stuff that they think no one else has ever heard of. And of course, everybody knows it. And I started to become quite fanatical about that sort of stuff. So I would go to car boot sales, and I can remember to this day buying Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, coming home and spending an hour with it in a bathtub with a couple of earbuds trying to clean the grooves to make it listenable. And so I sort of became into just listening to lots of things. And I had two ways of doing it. I would listen. My stepdad was a big music fan. He would always tell me stories about going to see Chuck Berry and The Who and Pink Floyd regularly in the 60s and 70s. And so I sort of started asking about different questions about bands. And what he would do is, if I'd gone out and bought a record, he would tape it for me onto a tape, and on the B side he'd put another record that he thought I might be interested in, which is how I ended up discovering the Doors. So I had one record I really knew and wanted on the front, and of course, because it was a cassette, you had to turn it over and play it again or forward wind. And so I started to listen to these other albums. So I got into bands that way. And then sometimes I would just be confused, and I'd say to my mum, I remember once being with my mum on holiday, and I walked into a shop called Woolworths in the UK, and they had this sort of bargain bin of cassettes. I remember saying to my mum, "Oh, what's this band, Deep Purple? Are they a bit like Pink Floyd?" And my mum just, for a quiet life, said, "Yeah, they're exactly the same. Get in the car." So I bought it, and I suddenly became a huge Deep Purple fan. And then I started doing things like getting obscure with my friends, because my friends and I would go into town at the weekends, and we'd go into record stores, and they'd pick up the latest record by Duran Duran or Aha. And I suddenly started to try and be as slightly obscure as possible. So I remember picking up 2112 by Rush, because it had them all dressed weirdly on the back. And they were like, "What have you bought?" And it was like, "Oh, I just think this looks cool." And then I remember I took it one stage further. I bought Gong, the Flying Teapot, one time, and I think they stopped asking me to go with them then. So that was really, I really sort of magpied loads and loads of stuff, but it was great. And I talked to my son. My son's 16, and he's just starting to do the same sort of thing. He's in that sort of crossover between music that he sort of still likes from his childhood and computer game music and stuff. And then he sort of listened to stuff the other day. He came up to me and he said, "I've never heard Stairway to Heaven." And so I'm starting to sit down with him and play him all these pieces. And, you know, I've got a room full of CDs, and I just go in and say, just pick stuff off the shelf. Just listen to things. Give it a try. And I play him loads of stuff. I play him Deep Purple, and I play him folk stuff. Anything I can think of that suddenly occurs to me is like, "Oh, that was a cool song." I just sort of throw it at him. And most of the time he walks away going, "Oh, for God's sake, Dad." But every now and then he comes back to me and said, "Oh, I went and listened to I'd listened to that Dream Theater record again the other day. That's pretty cool," you know. And so it's that sort of thing. But that was where so my music wasn't really massively inspired by Dad, but it sowed the seeds of it, really, to be open-minded. And
it sounds like it sounds like the two sliding doors moments, Oliver, actually, were your stepdad with the cassettes and the fact that you hit a great chord on your first try of the piano.
That's right.
Yeah, bit lucky, really. And then obviously moving into that area of Devon where it was very, very music orientated really helped as well, because when you're playing in blues bands and jam bands or house bands, you know, they're often just throwing songs up and you're just going, okay, and you don't know what it is. Or somebody says, "Oh, we're going to try a new Dan Reed Network song tonight." And you go, "Okay, right, let me find it." And then you suddenly listen to it and you go, "This is brilliant." And so you end up learning more and more and more stuff. And it's just amazing. And I was also lucky as well, because in North Devon, when I did all that sort of stuff, I was in my teens, and all the house bands were all sort of made up of people in their 30s and 40s. And so I started a trend that I've probably carried on through most of my life, which is always playing, or the majority of time, playing with people that are older than me. Yeah. So I've always had sort of raised the bar slightly to try and keep up, but also you learn a lot because they've got experience.
Absolutely. What a great training ground. So,
well, I hope so. Friends of people like my music.
Let's jump forward now to what you're working on currently. So we know that you've recently released a box set of the work you did with Clive Nolan. So tell us a bit about how this collaboration came to be, and had you always had a love for the rock opera style albums out there, or was that something that Clive introduced you to, or?
Well, how do we? If I start with where we met, probably I used to do a radio show. I used to have a friend of mine that did a rock show, and then we would often talk about I would often go. He owned a record shop. I'd often go to his record shop, and he'd recommend records for me to listen to. And he said, "I'm doing a rock show now. Do you want to come up and talk about progressive music?" He said, "Because I don't know anything about it, and I hear it's getting a bit of a sort of renaissance. So it'd be really good to actually do a little section in the middle of the show." So I used to go up and do this bit called the Prog Spot, where we would talk about classic records. And also, I was sort of getting to know people in the scene as well. So people were sending me records, and I would play those on the radio. And I remember some of the first records I got sent were things like "A Kindness to Strangers" by, I think, Spock's Beard and Roy Stoltz's first albums, and so really early days of these bands kicking off. And I used to play and promote them on the radio. And one of the times he phoned me up and he said, "I know you weren't due to come up this weekend." He said, "But I've got Mick Pointer from the original drummer with Marillion coming up for an interview. He's done this new album." He said, "Do you want to come up?" And I thought, yeah, I've got a couple of old Marillion 12 inches which Mick's on. It'll be nice to take those up, say hello, get them signed. So I did that, and we had a great time. And the evening just went on and on. We went out for drinks afterwards, and then he said to me, "Oh, you must come up and meet Clive. He's my keyboard player. He's brilliant. You'll come up. You two will get on really well." And I think I just did it. I just phoned up Clive one day and said, "Mick said I should give you a call," and he went, "Oh, great. Why don't you come up?" And I think you were already there, Matt, weren't you, at the time?
I think I was. I think I remember that first meeting.
Yeah. And in fact, you might be able to tell me whether this story is correct. Then the next one I'm going to tell. Normally,
fact check. This will be our first fact check podcast.
Normally I can get away with telling these stories and not get fact checked. But yeah, this time I'm going to check. I do remember I'd been up a couple of times, and it was before the studio moved to Virginia Water. It was in Maidenhead, and Steve Rothery had done a guitar solo on the Songs from the Lion Cage album, and we all went to the pub. And Clive and I were sat there, and he said, "Oh, Steve Rothery's coming in for a drink to say hello." And at that exact moment, Kaylee came on the jukebox.
I remember that.
Yeah, and he walked in, and I went, "Did you put that on?" And I just remember he sort of looked me up and down, and someone said, "This is Oliver." And I've never forgotten that. And then about half an hour after a couple of drinks, Clive said to me, just went, "Oh, we should do something together, you know." And that's where it started. We then started writing, and that was probably about 97, I think, probably 96, 97, something like that.
Yeah.
And yes, we did the first album, and then we that came out. Did Jabberwocky, yeah, which was very well received, did very well. I mean, I assume people know your background to the Verglass world, do they, Matt, or do we need to expand on that at the same time?
No, it'll all be known. Yes, that's all good.
That's okay. Okay, so I can drop you in it at many occasions.
That's okay.
And so the record came out with Verglass, and it did very well. I mean, we managed to get lots of great people to play on it. The late Peter Banks, obviously from Yes, was one. Bob Catley was another phenomenal musician. There was lots of what they used to call the Thin Ice Orchestra, which was the Tracy Hitchens, Dave Wagstaff. Those musicians came on board as well. And we had a great time, and it did really well. And I seem to remember, Matt, you might deflate my ego here quite quickly, but I seem to remember it did sell out quite quickly. That's too long a pause, Matt.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's too long a pause, Matt. Or maybe he's gone. Have we lost you, Matt?
He doesn't want to answer at all.
Sorry, I was on mute. That's why you couldn't hear.
Yeah, likely excuse.
No, from memory, I think it did do very well, and I think there was a lot of interest, obviously, with you getting involved with Clive. So, and obviously, you continued that relationship with 2 more albums.
Yeah, well, we did The Hand of the Baskervilles after that, which came out about 3 years later. We did a long time working on that because that was a much more sort of integral story to work into a record for that one, whereas Jabberwocky was a sort of, we made up a story around the nonsense poem, and The Hound of the Baskervilles was a lot more prescriptive. So that was a harder album to do. And the thing I always liked about those 2 albums was that we didn't the second album didn't just sound like a clone of the first. We managed to capture the atmosphere of the story, whereas Jabberwocky was a little bit more sort of light-hearted,
Yes.
gentle sort of album, still with hard-hitting bits. Whereas Hound of the Baskervilles, because of its the nature of the story, was a little bit more hard-hitting and a little bit more aggressive. And so I think that worked really well. And then we were due to start on a third one, which we started, but then the record company turned around and said, we haven't got any more money. And so we sort of didn't get to work on it. And so we drifted off into our different worlds. Clive went off into working, with his musical crowd and carrying on with Arena and Pendragon. And I went off and started working with other musicians like Steve Howe, and then ended up joining the Strawbs and Yes and doing all that silliness. And so we sort of kept in sporadic touch, really. And then a couple of years ago, I did a box set of the work that I did with Yes, and that sold very well, and actually was a surprise to the Yes management and the record company, and said, that went really well. Have you got anything else that we think would make a nice box set? And then I said, well, there's these albums that Clive and I did that are out of print, and they aren't digitally available. And, you can find them on eBay, but they're very expensive. I was looking today, actually. I just searched this morning for something on Amazon, and it recommended I buy Hound of the Baskervilles by me and Clive for 225 quid.
Wow.
And I just thought this is ridiculous. As much as anybody would like to think they're worth it, I don't think anybody should be paying that sort of money for a CD.
No,
And so I said to Clive, look, I've got an opportunity here. I said I can find a way of getting the costs covered to repress it and get it out through the label. And he was like, yeah, great. And so I suggested this to the management company, and they went, that sounds terrific. Yeah. Have you got anything else that you could put in as a third disc? And I went, I said, we've probably got some demos and bits and pieces, but I'm never really a great fan of just putting out a third disc that somebody listens to once because it's got a slightly different vocal take or a version of the song from the album slightly worse.
Yeah.
Never been a massive fan of that. And so I sort of searching through things and thought, well, what have I got? And I came across this folder, and I suddenly remembered that Clive and I had started to write a third album based on Frankenstein, but we'd never actually I didn't think we'd got very far with it. But when I went through this folder of mine, I suddenly realized I had about 15, 20 minutes, and Clive went through a folder of his and realized he had about 15 minutes. And then I went through another folder and found that I'd written 3 other pieces of music for Hound, which we hadn't used. And I suddenly realized that actually there was probably about 50 minutes of unheard music. So we basically then started working as we used to work, obviously within the constraints of lockdown and budget. That was, okay, we've got these songs, and some of them were shells and some of them were a bit more developed. But then we started to work as we always did, which was sending each other's songs, listening to it, adding parts, coming back with ideas. Clive sent me an instrumental, and I said, look, I think you could make that into a vocal song. It cover this part of the story.
Yep.
And then there was another piece that I did, which was started off as a piano piece. And I sent it to Clive and said, look, I don't, I think it'd be nice if you did the orchestration on this rather than me doing it. So he did the orchestration. And when I heard his orchestration, I suddenly thought, actually, it lends itself nicely to a song there. And so some words started to come. And then I started doing that. And then it's like, oh, a bit of guitar would be. And suddenly, once you got one piece up to a really high level, you'd suddenly go, oh, now the other 11 don't sound as good. So we suddenly started to keep raising the bar. And so we ended up doing that. And because we were all in lockdown, it was really tricky. It was like, okay, well, it's going to be we're not going to be able to get a drummer to do this because nobody can get into a studio to record drums at the moment. So we had to make do with not having a drummer on it. But we covered most other things. A guitarist friend of mine, David Mark Pierce, who plays in my band, did guitars over everything for us. It happened that Andy Sears was staying with Clive, who was a very well-known singer. So he sang on a couple of tracks, and I'm still very good friends with Paul Manzi, who played with Arena and my band, and he now plays with the Suite, and he sang a couple of tracks, and I knew this young vocalist that was looking for an opportunity to sing, and so she came on board. And then when I needed a classical guitarist, it was like, well, you know, I worked with Gordon Giltrap for many years, and I sort of phoned up, said, hey Gordon, would you do this? And he said yeah. And so suddenly we ended up doing what we did before, which was managing to pull in lots of really established, very, very good musicians to play on songs that up until a few months ago were just sort of languishing in a folder because there'd never been any project for them to come out of. And I'm a bit of a stickler if I'm writing for a storied album or a record in some description that's got a theme. I'm not a great one for just going in and saying, oh, there was that piece I once wrote it about toadstools, but now I'm going to make it about apples. I'm not very good at doing that. If a piece of music was written for a story or an idea or a particular emotive piece of a story, it kind of has to retain that, because that's where the magic happened. That's where it came from for me. I don't know, other musicians are different. Other people magpie stuff all over the place. And I probably do maybe with instrumental bits, but songs with lyrics in particular just felt that they wouldn't easily transition into something else. So that gave the whole third album a bit of authenticity. But when we realized we didn't have the whole of the Frankenstein story done, because we'd obviously never had the money to take it past the initial writing, which is when you really start to craft it and pull the story structure together, we realized that this third album couldn't be called Frankenstein. So Clive had come up with a title when we were talking about a third album. When we realized we didn't have the money, he said to me, why don't we just do a keyboard album and make all the instrumentals based on, you know, fables that are all dark, you know, rather than light fables. And I sort of thought, oh, dark fables, that's a nice title. But I didn't think people would be interested in an album that wasn't like Jabberwocky or Hound. I didn't think people would be that happy with that. So I wasn't too keen on it. Clive probably wasn't too keen on it. But when we came to do this third album, it seemed like a really good title to use, because it did encompass, you know, the three albums in a sort of dark way. And so we did that, and then we sort of put it together in a box set, and had to spend first thing we did actually was spend ages coming up with the title for the box set, and we came up with Tales by Gaslight, because each of the stories is based on Victorian or Edwardian literary novels.
Yeah,
that's right.
And then it was just rebuilding everything. And I remember, I've got to tell this bit quickly, but I had to rebuild all the booklets, because I don't know whether your listeners do know this, but Matt did the original Jabberwocky logo.
Oh wow!
You did many years ago, and Clive couldn't find the file anywhere, and the old computer had got thrown away, and all the artwork had gone. So I had to rebuild all the old art, rebuild it with new artwork. But I thought, I can't not use the Jabberwocky logo because it was so good. So I was searching around and then found a very old promotional flyer that was put together for Inside Out Music, and I managed to cut it all out and rebuild your logo, Matt, and use it on the cover.
Oh, that's fantastic! Amazing. What a great story!
You've just made his year, and no, and we'll definitely be linking Oliver to the box set and so on. People definitely need to check it out. And I'm impressed you did manage a third album, because I hear that Clive Nolan bloke's a nightmare to deal with, because we had him on the podcast a few episodes back, and what a lovely bloke he is. Now being serious,
he was great. It was like old times actually, because I think people find it a bit strange, sort of going, oh, but you're a keyboard player working with another keyboard player. Don't you get in each other's way, and don't you argue, and don't you fight? And it's like, well, Clive summed it up when we did an interview together. We did a Q&A together on YouTube, and you know, one of the questions was, well, it must be odd, two keyboard players, and how did you work together? And Clive just went, well, it was a collaboration. You know, we both wrote lyrics, we both arranged, and we both soloed. So we just worked together and, you know, added what parts we wanted to each other's pieces of music. And it was always about the song. You know, we had an agreement that it was always about the song and about the story. And, you know, I would come up with some ideas, and then suddenly I'd find that Clive had written an instrumental, and suddenly my bit was in the middle of it, because he said that's what it needed. And I've had a song once, and I sort of went, I can't really come up with a chorus for this. And he'd say, oh, well, I've got something that might work. And then there were pieces that were just mine and pieces that were just his, and we just played on. And we just worked really well together. And then someone said, "Yeah, that's really weird. Two keyboard players working together." And I said, "Well, why? Guitarists have been doing it for years.
That's
Nobody
right.
complains. Nobody complains that a rock band's got two guitarists.
That's
So
right.
why should it be odd?
Here.
We've got yeah." So it was great, and when we sort of started doing this again, we were fine, but we were doing it all over the internet, just emails first of all, and stuff, and then we had to get together for some photos, and we and then we had to do these video chats, and it really was just like jumping straight back in. It really was very, very strange, and I ended up back up at Thin Ice Studios recently to do some work. And bumped into Clive and his partner Sean was there, and David Wilson was there, and it was like, blimey, nothing changes. Who would have thought?
That's great. Just like old times.
It was like I came out and said to my wife, I said, 26 years later, and I walk into the studio, and it's like a lot of the same people. It's just really weird that part of your life just doesn't change. It just stays stable with people doing what they love.
It's a nice feeling. That's for sure. So, Oliver, you mentioned earlier the silliness of being drawn into Yes. I understand that may not have been the easiest of experiences for you, but having grown up around the band to some extent and having known some of the guys relatively well, did it ever feel like a natural progression for you to join the ranks, or how did it sort of come about that you ended up in the band?
Well, I'd worked with Steve Howe when I stopped with Clive. The next album that I did, actually, no, I did it in between the albums. Actually, between Jabberwocky and Hound, I did an album with Steve Howe called The 3 Ages of Magick, which was all stuff I'd written, and Steve played guitar and was the executive producer on. And that was, a great fun album to work on. And at the time, that was around the time that Igor joined Yes. And one time we were sat in his lounge, and Steve said to me, he said, "How crazy would you feel if I suggested you for the keyboard player role in Yes?" And I thought, blimey. I said, "I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. If you want to ask me." But nothing ever came of it because John had already found this Russian bloke, and that followed the path that it did. And then many years later, it was 2007. It was around Christmas time, 2007, and I walked in. The phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Steve, and we kept in touch all the time. And I played on a couple of his albums as well, and we used to catch up socially. I mean, Steve's he's quite a reclusive chap and spends a lot of time on his own, but we always actually got on very, very well, and would often meet up and have chats and talk music and whatnot. And he phoned up and he just said, would you like to join Yes? I went, what? He said, "Well, your dad doesn't want to do it." And he said, "No, I think you could do it. I think you'd be a good fit." He said, "Your dad recommended you. And what do you think?" And I said, "Well, if you can just, give me 10 seconds to think about it." So I sort of put my hand over the speaker, said to my wife, and she sort of nodded at me. And I went, "Yeah, great." And it was when John was in the band. It was to do the 40th anniversary. And so my world sort of went into this world of, right, okay, I'm doing this thing now. And I started having lots of conversations with John Anderson about, what the set was going to be, how he wanted it to work, blah, blah, blah. And we went through all this stuff. And then John got sick and then couldn't do it. And that's when Steve came back to me and said, "Look, Yes has been dormant for too long. We want to go back out on the road and do stuff. We've got this tribute singer, Benoit David. Are you still on board?" And I said, yeah, of course I am. I'm obviously sad for John, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to go out and play this great music. Yeah. And so that was it. And then they gave me a set list. I had 2 weeks to learn it on my own. And that was the old-fashioned way of sitting with a CD, stopping it, going back, listening, stopping, listening over and over again. And they had this way that they wanted to work, which was that they wanted to do what Yes had been doing over the years, which was change the arrangements slightly. But what they wanted to do was, instead of doing all the bits where Dad and other members of the band that had come in had sort of ad-libbed and made stuff up. They said, we want to do everything actually as per the originals. So it was really difficult to learn because I didn't have the opportunity to just sit there and listen to one song. I'd sort of have to learn the original, then listen to the live versions and work out the bits that needed to be changed and go back to the original. So it was quite a complex piece of learning. And of course, the first set was 3.5 hours long. And I had 2 weeks to learn it before I got to rehearsals. We had 3 weeks of rehearsals, which was my first time with the keyboard rig, because all the keyboards were out in America. I got all keyboard rig built for me. And I remember turning up it was Hamilton in Canada. And I turned up on day one. And of course, they've all been playing together for, 30 years. Benoit had been playing in a Yes tribute band for 5 years. And as I said at the beginning of this, I'd never spent any of my time ever learning any of Dad's music or Yes's music. And so it was all new to me. And then, of course, I got to know Chris Squire really well, but then I also learned about his legendary, not starting early reputation. So, I'd say, right, okay, so it's rehearsals tomorrow morning. He said, yeah, I'll be there around 1. And it was like, okay, and what time do we go through till? Well, about 5. And it's like,
oh dear.
Okay, so you're giving me, we've got 3 weeks to get ready for the first show, and we're going to do, what's that for? It's 20 hours a week. So we've got 60 hours to do a 3.5 hour set, and we've never played together before. And so I used to get up really early, go into the rehearsal room and just sit there with headphones on and just play and play and play and play and play until it just sort of got into my head. Then we'd finish rehearsals. I'd come back, get something to eat, sit in my room with a USB keyboard and a headphone and the songs and just play and just refine and refine and refine. And it was, it was very, very hectic.
Wow.
Really, really difficult, but great fun, and after about 5 shows, the band sort of fell into a bit of a rhythm. And on the second tour, it suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. And then by the second year, we were, Chris came up to me once and he said there isn't a Yes song that this lineup couldn't do justice to. And I took that as an enormous compliment.
Absolutely.
It's huge.
Yeah. And so that was great, but I didn't know Chris before the tour. I only knew Alan briefly. And obviously my main relationship was with Chris.
Yeah.
With Steve rather. So it was new, and they did say it was a bit weird sometimes looking across the stage, because I have a passing resemblance to my dad, and they used to say it was a bit weird looking across on stage sometimes, because it just looked to them like Dad was up there playing at times. Which was a bit strange. And then, Chris said to me once on the way back from a gig, I think I said something, and he said, you're so much like your father 50% of the time. He said, and the other 50% of the time, he said, you're nothing like him. And I went, oh, okay, that's nice. And he said, and you tell an awful lot less bottom jokes.
Oh, that's great. Love it. And so, Oliver, I know you've got to be somewhere in a while. I'd love to talk about that Yes rig, but I'm going to avoid that question and just talk more broadly. What are your go-to pieces of gear that you love at the moment and use regularly, whether it's on album recordings or when you were able to do live work up until recently?
I did some endorsement for a company called Dexabel, who do some wonderful pianos, and I have a H7 sat next to me here, which I do most of my writing on now. A lovely keyboard. It looks to me, it looks like the sort of piano Apple would make if they ever made a piano. It's just a lovely design. It's basically what I've got in this room. I've got a little writing room, and the sort of pieces, the keyboards that stay with me are in here. I've got a Kronos SE behind me, which is lovely. And I've got my Moog little fatty that came everywhere on tour with me up on the top. I've got some virtual Moogs, but I still tend to like going up there and fiddling with that, and because you get a bit of performance feel with it. I love, and I've got it's going to sound phenomenally old fashioned, but years ago I bought a couple of Roland D50s as just
they're nice,
just lovely workhorse keyboards. Nothing about them that was particularly standout. They just did everything really well.
That's right.
And so I tend to use those. I use a lot of virtual stuff. I do a lot of IK multimedia stuff. But I'm nothing particularly outlandish. I'm not a phenomenally technical programmer. My keyboard tech is really into that. I've always been a bit of a player first rather than a techie person, and I have nothing but admiration for people that can sit there and completely construct a sound from nothing. I've never had that. I'm not sure whether it's patience or ability, but I've always been a bit more of a turn it on and play and get inspired sort of player. But yeah, those are the ones that really sort of stick with me. I mean, I've got loads of sort of traditionals. I've got the old Korg 01W, which is also a very good workhorse.
Nice.
I'm trying to think what's in the garage. It's the M3. Korg M3 was a very nice keyboard. I used that.
Was.
The one I do really like is the old Korg CX7, the organ.
Oh, yeah.
That's a very nice keyboard as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, that'll make our gearheads happy, Oliver. I felt the need to cover that. So, yeah, back to you, Matt, for the substantive question.
So, at the start of this interview, Oliver, you mentioned about doing a bit of work with Rodney Matthews. And for those that don't know Rodney, he's been well known through the years of doing some fantastic album covers for bands like Magnum and Eloy and the Jabberwocky project that we were just talking about as well.
Yeah.
But not many people know that he's a musician. So can you tell us a little bit about the musical relationship that you have with Rodney? I know you've known him for a long time, but how did you get playing with him?
Yeah, I mean, the story with Rodney is great. I started in this. When I was at college, I did art as college, as most musicians do, and I ended up doing my final diploma on an artist. And my tutor, who knew my family history, came up to me and said, "Right, you've all got to pick an artist to do your final project on." And she looked at me and she said, "I presume you're going to choose Roger Dean?" And I just went, "No." And so I suddenly thought, right, who can I choose? And I'd bought, as I was talking about earlier on in my stuff of going out and buying obscure records, I had bought Bo Hansen's Lord of the Rings record purely because of the cover, which had Rodney's cover on it. And I looked on the back and it was Rodney Matthews. And so I managed to get in touch with him. And he was very gracious, wrote me a lovely handwritten letter back, sent me his books, wrapped them up in posters, and said, whatever you need, just let me know. So I did all these questions, asking him how pieces came about, and did my project and completed my course and passed it. So, and we'd sort of then from that point on, we sort of kept in sporadic touch. And I did a few bits of album design for somebody. I took my art skills to keep doing design work, and I did some album sleeves which involved his work. And then he wrote to me one day and he phoned me up. That was it. He phoned me up and he said, I'm doing a record. And I said, "Oh yeah." And he said, "Yeah, I play drums." And he had a point in his life where he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be a drummer or whether he wanted to be an artist. He was that on the cusp of which way he was going to go. And he actually even played in a band, I think, that supported Yes many, many, many years ago. And he phoned me up and he said, "Look, I've been working on this record." I said, "Oh, how long have you been working on this record for?" And he went, by next Thursday, it'll be 20 years. And I went, "Oh, okay." And basically, he had a guitarist, Jeff Sheets, that was in America. And every time he'd gone over to America, they'd sat down and written some ideas and put some stuff together. And he said, "We're sort of getting to the point now where we've got enough for the album. And we think it could do with some, other instrumentation on it." So he came to my house and sort of said, "Well, this is one of the pieces, and it's got me playing drums, and we've got a bit of bass on it, and the guitars and things." And I listened to it, and I said, "Well, what are you looking for? Are you looking for me to just, plonk keyboards on top, and then just, say, great, lovely that we've done some stuff together, or are you looking for a musical opinion?" And he said, "I'll go for the musical opinion." He said, "I know you've done a lot of stuff. I'd be interested to see what you think." And so I sort of blindsided him a bit because he sat next to me and I sat at the keyboards. And then 5 hours later, I'd sort of chopped parts out, added bits in, extended sections, done all the orchestrations, keyboards on top, and added a solo. And he sort of sat there and went, well, that was terrific. Thanks very much. And I sort of went, well, if you don't like it, doesn't matter. I'll do what you want me to do. And he sort of went, okay, well, it was great to see you. And then he got in his car and he drove home. And he said, and on the way home, he listened to the song, and then he listened to it again. He got home and he said he played it to his son, and his son went, that's amazing, Dad. And then he phoned me up and he said, I can see what you did now. I can see why you cut the bits you cut and why you did that. He said, it flows much better. And I said, well, sometimes that happens if you're not too close to the music. If you're a little bit apart from it, you can hear the music without being too emotionally attached to it. And he said, would you do another one? I said, yeah, of course I will. And then ended up doing, I think it was like 10 of the 11 pieces on the record. And that's how we ended up working. And wow. It was great. And there was some songs where they couldn't do some stuff and they needed me to write some bits. And I wrote a piece for him. And then they wanted to do Mussorgsky's Night on Bear Mountain. And they'd condensed, that's about 20 minutes, that piece. And they said, well, the second half is all really quiet orchestrations. So I had to completely orchestrate the end part of that piece. And I said, and how have you done the first part, the first 10 minutes with all the orchestrations and stuff? He said, oh, we've condensed that down into 2 minutes of drum and bass. And it was like, okay, right. So my bit's 10 minutes of pure intricate classical stuff, and you've just rocked out for 2.5 minutes picking the bits that you like best. Okay. And and it really worked. But and we've just become great friends. And we in fact, I wrote to him earlier on today. We're going to catch up in the week. And then we did a Christmas single together, and then we did another Christmas single together, and I'm sure we'll do another one at some point. And then I did the music for his film that came out recently, which was a film called The Journey of a Junior Adventurer, and I did the soundtrack for that, and that's been very well received as well. So it's a sort of an ongoing relationship, really. It's just great fun. He's a great drummer. He's a really good drummer, and he's unusual. He's not a traditional rock drummer either. He comes from a bit of a jazz background, so he sort of does a lot more playing around the kit in a jazz way than you would normally expect in rock music. So it gives it an interesting feel to the music as well, which is great.
That's
great stuff. And it sounds to me like that's another really creative collaboration, and it sounds like it's gone relatively well. So I think that's a good segue to the polar opposite, which is when things haven't gone well, Oliver, because we're sort of hitting the home stretch here. What's your most memorable train wreck on stage? When have things gone terribly wrong for you that you can recall?
Oh, I'd like to say never, but I'll have to.
You'd be the first guest that did.
There was one that was particularly difficult, and I never actually owned up to it. But I'll do it now because it seems like we're all friends together. I went on tour with Bob Catley, and he sent me all the music, and I learned it. I learned the whole set, learned everything down perfectly, and then when we got to the rehearsals, out of the sort of 14 songs in the set, 7 of them, he suddenly said, oh, actually, I need to do this a semitone down. Oh. I went, oh, you're kidding me. I said, we're in rehearsals. We've got 3 rehearsals, and we do our first show in a week and a half. I said, and you want to do 7 of the songs in a different key? Mm. And the guitarist said, yeah, we're not relearning it. We're just going to have a second guitar and down detuned by a semi. So I went, okay, right. Well, what I'll do is I'll just, transpose the keyboard for those 7 songs. That's just. And to be fair, some of the songs with the solo parts were solos that didn't really lend themselves to A flat instead of A. So, which I think a lot of keyboard players will probably, particularly if you've got sliding notes where you're sliding off of, an E flat to an E, and suddenly you've got sort of slide up from a D to an E flat. It doesn't quite work. So you use a lot of that flow when you're playing. So we agreed that this was the way that we were going to be able to do this to accommodate Bob's voice. And we got to one show, and there was one song which I had to start the song with, and it was one of these tracks that I was supposed to go back up to, standard tuning, and the last song had finished a semitone down, and because it was just me and Bob, I played, and he could sing along with it perfectly, and it was like about a minute the intro of just me and him, and then when the rest of the band came in, it sounded absolutely appalling because they were semi-toned out, and they just sort of looked at each other and confused, and I sort of looked at them and went, "Oh, for goodness sake, we're going to have to start again." And transposed it and then started again, and then it went through perfectly, and they all went, "What on earth happened there?" And I was like, "I've no idea. What's wrong with you lot?"
That's the best transposed story ever, Oliver, because that's different. Yeah, that's a little bit different. I love that. That's great.
So yeah, so that was a bit of a moment, yeah.
So the final two, I know we've got to let you go. The final two brain teaser questions,
yeah,
Oliver,
we're okay for a few things.
That's okay. So tag a keyboard player is a regular thing we do. So inspirations for you that if you had the opportunity to hear them interviewed, if you haven't already, that you'd love to hear speak about their career.
Oh, well, there's a couple of kids. I mean, obviously everybody thinks that Dad is my inspiration, and you know, he's an influence. I can't deny that. You know, it's difficult to not be influenced by everything he's done in his life. But frankly, I've heard a lot of him talking over the years.
That's
so
right.
I don't need to hear any more from Dad. You know, sometimes if I'm ever with him and we're having breakfast, it's like, you know what, Dad, we don't need a joke now. We can keep it quiet for a bit. But I was always a huge fan of Jon Lord, massive fan of Jon Lord. And I know it's not their favorite, even their own favorite album or the average Deep Purple fan's favorite album, but I always loved Who Do We Think We Are? And I think Jon Lord has got some of the most amazing keyboard solos on that album.
It does.
I can't remember which track it was. I think it might be Rat Bat Blue. There's an amazing keyboard solo in Rat Bat Blue or not, but it's one of those tracks around the middle of the album. And it's just astounding. And I would love to talk to him or listen to him talk about that sort of stuff, because, you know, obviously he died. I can't remember how long ago it was now, like 10 years ago, but you know,
ago, yeah.
Yeah, but it was before I sort of managed to sort of get myself into a different position in the music world where I would have been able to interact with him or get to shows. I did go to see him play, you know, as a fan. I went along and watched him play. I mean, and nowadays with, you know, the way that we've all worked in music for such a long time, we all, you know, we're all on a sort of similar circuit. So you bump into people that in the past would have been your idols, and suddenly you're finding that they're your peers is probably the wrong word, but they're on the same circuit that you're doing, and you're going, and you're getting to know them as different people. But Jon Lord, I never got that opportunity with, and I would love to have. I'd love to have sat and listened to him talk about those early days. That would have been quite something.
Yeah. Good choice.
Great pick. Yeah, great pick. And then the last one, I did give you some warning about a minute before we started recording, Oliver. Desert Island is 5 albums you couldn't live without.
Right. Well, I've got 5 here, and they aren't. I wouldn't say they're the 5 albums I couldn't live without, but they're the 5 albums that I think have actually had the most plays in my life. I think, which, because even though sometimes I might put them on and go, oh God, not this again, but and some of them are slightly one or the other, depending. I'm always torn between 2112 and Hemispheres by Rush, because I love the rawness of 2112 and the fact it's just the 3 of them with just their primary instruments. But I love Hemispheres because it's got the added additional instrumentation on it, and it's a development. But either of those two, I don't mind.
Choice. Excellent choice.
Obviously, we just talked about Who Do We Think We Are, because that was a formative record for me. The Grand Illusion by Styx, because it was one of those records that came down from the attic when I was a kid, and I still absolutely love it. I can listen to that today, and it's still as fresh as it was. And things like The Angry Young Man and Miss America, just amazing tracks, which I have no problem listening to over and over again. There was an album which I think maybe people don't know, but there was an artist called Poe who did an album called Haunted, which I absolutely love. It's very difficult to find, but if you can find it, it's an album I listened to over and again. The story behind it was the story that I heard behind the album was that it was a lady whose father had died and left her answers to all the questions he thought she would ask him if he was still alive. And she found these cassettes of all these questions and answers, and then built an album around all the things that she would tell him.
Okay,
and
I want to listen to that.
Yeah. It's an amazing album. You might not float your boat, but for me, I listen to it and I just love it. Great. I love the concept behind it. I love the thought behind it, and so many great songs on there. And the other one, which was a big one for me, was Eat Me in St. Louis by It Bites, because that was just a phenomenal album, and I listened to that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. I think I like all their other stuff, but that album for me was just the perfect blend of a band on the cusp of really making it and then sort of mucking it up. But that was the album. That's the album before they mucked it up, where they were just on the flow. And just underneath that, the Bubbling Unders, which were my other ones, was probably something like Slam by Dan Reed Network. Was always, and there's probably a few of my dad's in there and stuff that I probably should have thrown in there.
But they're great picks. Great picks.
Yeah, they were the 5 that I think really sort of I could pick those up at any time, or I sort of tried to do that in a mind of what would I want to sit down and make my son listen to, and those would probably be
right.
I'd say have a listen to these. This is how it's done.
That's good parenting right there.
It is good parenting right there. So, Oliver, cannot thank you enough for that. I know we could talk for hours and we only scratched the surface, but really appreciate you spending the time you have with us, and look forward to the great stuff coming up for you. And may you have some great live gigs in the coming year.
Oh, fingers crossed. And I may even get down to your part of the world at some point.
Even better. We'd love to see you.
Never played there, but I will try.
Yeah, good bucket list thing to do. So, no, thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely to talk to you again, Oliver.
So I think it's fair to say that our prediction at the start of the show, Matt, was that Oliver was a good guy to talk to, as well and truly born fruit. That was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. He's got some great stories, and he's worked with some really interesting musicians. So he makes for a great interviewee for sure.
Yeah, no, that was an absolute pleasure. So a huge thanks to Oliver for that. It was really, really valued. And as we joked as we got off the recording about Oliver coming down under, we do hope you'll book it during the Australian winter, because it sounds like the sun and Oliver don't mix well. So we look forward to seeing you, Oliver, down here at some stage in June, July or August in 1 year, when we're all back to somewhat normal. So, yeah, thank you again.
Fingers crossed.
So we'll be back again in the next few weeks, but just a reminder that you can keep in touch via a few means. Our website is www.keyboardchronicles.com. We're still on Facebook, well and truly, at facebook.com/Keyboard Chronicles, on Twitter at the Keyboard CHR1, and always keen for the good old-fashioned email at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. I'd also like to give a special shout-out to our Patreon contributors. We appreciate you every single week, and if you'd like to become an official supporter, we do have a Patreon account where for the price of a coffee a month you can help us go from strength to strength, and you do get some benefits of that. You certainly do get to have input into questions when we get the opportunity, if the timelines do it. We do like to give people a preview of what's coming up next, and we've also started creating some extra content for Patreon subscribers. So if you are interested in doing that, it's patreon.com/Keyboard Chronicles. A huge thank you to you, Matt, for joining me. This was an absolute pleasure, and I do need to warn you that the next prog guest we get back, I may be calling on your services again. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Pleasure was all mine, David. Thank you.
And most importantly, thanks to you all out there for listening, and we hope to see you back here next episode.